Today's video is on the UN and Agenda 21. Agenda 21 began in 1992 at the Rio Conference on Sustainable Development. Governments from around the world wanted to develop a plan for sustainable growth on a global basis. They believed that civilization was destroying the planet and that without such a plan, the extinction of life on Earth was fast approaching. The plan called for ending poverty, management of all natural resources, sustainable consumption and production practices, and the establishment of the rule of law on a global basis. The program for the implementation of Agenda 21 was reaffirmed at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, South Africa in 2002. In June of 2012, the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development was held in Rio de Janeiro. It created a plan that provided for the implementation of Sustainable Developmental Goals, SDGs, on a global basis. Participating governments agreed to strengthen the United Nations Environment Program with action to be taken during the 66th session of the General Assembly. Member countries requested that the United Nations implement a program that would track the progress of reaching its intended goals. A 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production patterns was adopted. At the United Nations Sustainable Development Summit in New York in September of 2015, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 SDGs were adopted. The manifesto is entitled Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Notice the use of the word transforming, which means they want to change the world to the way they think it should be. Remember what the FABIANs want to do: hammer the world on an anvil until it meets their heart's desire. This is corporate fascism by the global elite. Later that year, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change was established. The program endeavors to oversee all resources, land, water, minerals, food, oil, etc., and the control of all means of production, including energy, education, and the population of the world, which are viewed as human resources. Recall Mr. Turner's explanation in the video on the Club of Rome. He wants to reduce the world's population by about 80% because, quote, there are too many people using too much stuff, end of quote. At least he's honest about it. Now the UN has a mandate to run the world according to a one world order. Representing the U.S. in Rio was President George H. Bush, who was signed on to the program. After Bush left office, President Clinton established the President's Council for Sustainable Development to implement Agenda 21 into all agencies of the federal government. Global warming became the rallying cry of the program. President Obama followed in Clinton's footsteps. He believed that climate change was a security threat to the nation, and he signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015 to eliminate global warming. Obama instructed federal agencies to consider climate change when drawing up their national security plans. President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Accord. He believes that the cost of complying with government regulations to limit climate change poses a greater threat to national security than the changes themselves. Trump canceled Obama's national security memorandum and other climate-relating directives. This was a smart move on Trump's part. He should be given credit when credit is due. It is notable to point out that Agenda 21 has not been realized in the 27 years since its inception. Hence, a new plan has been rolled out, Agenda 30, which gives them another 10 years to fulfill their goals. Based on past performance, it doesn't look like they will be very successful. Nevertheless, the people need to know what the United Nations is up to, the creation of a one-world government in control of the entire planet. We must remain vigilant if we are to remain a free and prosperous people, especially our children and their children to come. Climate change, the Green Movement, a sustainable world order, whatever name you choose to call it by, is a form of socialism that seeks to take possession of private property, including all human resources. In other words, we the people. These ideals are far removed from the Constitution, which focuses on the freedom of the sovereign individual as opposed to an all-powerful state. The Constitution is a trust document between we the people and the elected officials we hire as trustees to run the government. The trustees have a fiduciary responsibility to the people who are the beneficiaries of that trust. This is not the way the government presently functions. It is a monster that has grown out of control. First, we will have a video by Donald Trump.
Wherever true socialism or communism has been adopted, it has delivered anguish and devastation and failure. Those who preach the tenets of these discredited ideologies only contribute to the continued suffering of the people who live under these cruel systems. America stands with every person living under a brutal regime. Our respect for sovereignty is also a call for action. All people deserve a government that cares for their safety, their interests, and their well-being, including their prosperity.
The plan calls for a global government, i.e., the United Nations, to take control of all land use while leaving no decision-making in the hands of private property owners. It is assumed that the common man is not a good steward of their land, and that the elite will do a better job. Recall how President Obama explained it. Individual rights are to give way to the needs of the community as determined by the governing body. The almighty state is placed above the individual. This is what collectivism does. The group is more important than the individuals that make up the group. The greater good for the greater number is all that matters, especially when the elite are above all individuals and the group. The plan calls for people to move off of rural land and pack together in human settlements, smart cities, islands of human habitation close to employment centers. Present modes of transportation, i.e. cars, are to be replaced by bicycles. Another program called the Wildlands Project spells out how most of the land is to be set aside for non-humans. Human habitation, as it is referred to, is restricted to lands within the urban growth boundaries of the city. Only certain building designs are permitted. Rural property is restricted as to how it can be used. Approximately 50% of all rural land is to be used for the preservation of wild animals. Although planners say they're for eating locally produced food, farmers markets, etc., many farmers are losing their land. There's nothing wrong with some, the operative word being some, of these goals. Everyone wants to end starvation and the human trafficking of children. Nevertheless, all these goals cannot be forced down the people's throat by a global government that hasn't been elected by the people. Change must occur naturally by a free and independent process, whereby sovereign individuals elect representatives to effect the changes the people want and vote for. It is important to realize that the plan the UN envisioned involves the entire educational system, the energy system, the transportation system, the government system, the healthcare system, the monetary system, religious practices, food production, resource control, and the power to determine production and consumption patterns of the people. The individual will no longer have any say over his life. His freedom and liberty would be taken from him. He would become an indentured servant of a new world order, as George Orwell's 1984 book predicted. This is not a joke. It is a very real and serious possibility. And don't think that the plan isn't already being implemented. It is. Ask your local school system what mandates and funding they receive from the state and what those mandates say. Take a look at your kids' books, not only what they say, but who wrote and published them. You will find the foundations of the elite hard at work. The Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rothschild Foundation, etc. Recall what Senator Dodd said in the Council on Foreign Relations video. Ask your State Department of Education what federal mandates and funds they get. Question your federally elected officials on what mandates the U.S. gets from the United Nations, and you will see a lethal trickle-down system at work that was explained in the earlier video, the FABIAN Society. Our kids have already been indoctrinated into this global citizenry program for a one world order. It fills their books and impressionable minds. Doesn't it sound cool to be a global citizen? You're not from your little hometown anymore. You're now a global citizen of the entire world. It is much easier to indoctrinate kids than to argue and change the minds of adults. The elite are in no hurry. They will wait until the older generation dies off and their children go out into the world indoctrinated in the belief that they, as global citizens, must do their part to bring about a one world order of sustainable production and consumption run by the elite plutocracy. There are those at the top and behind the scenes that have a far different agenda than most UN members. This is how high-level Masons and other secret societies work. They infiltrate and pull the strings from within and from above. Remember what Rockefeller stated, as he has financed a great deal of the UN program, including donating one of the most expensive pieces of real estate in New York as the United Nations headquarters. Recall what James Warburg, the son of the famous banker Paul Warburg, who created the Federal Reserve, stated before Congress, quote, "We shall have world government whether or not we like it. The only question is whether world government will be achieved by conquest or consent," close quote. Moreover, there are two huge problems facing the UN. First, how is all this going to be organized and implemented, as it is a colossal undertaking? Remember, we're talking about changing the entire world. The UN answers, quote, "Effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. A major shift in the priorities of both governments and individuals and an unprecedented redeployment of human and financial resources. End of quote. This is without doubt a transformation that is unattainable as well as undesirable. To think that one institution can effect such change in 10 years is incomprehensible. As Mr. Amin from the UN has said, quote, the United Nations has set itself yet more goals, but failed to heed the report's warning about lack of results. What we have now is another multiplication of targets and goals, which are an extraordinarily comprehensive assessment of what's needed to be done, but there is no operational clarity around them. Who's going to do it? Who's going to monitor it? Who's accountable for it? The goals themselves are pretty impressive, but it doesn't say anything to the United Nations about what they should be doing. End of quote. The second problem is how all of this is going to be paid for. The Chronicles maintains that the foremost cause of most world problems is the unequal distribution of wealth and the myriad of other problems that result therefrom. As the following chart shows, approximately 1% of the world's population owns 50% of the world's wealth. This is a staggering statistic, and it isn't getting better, it's getting worse. If things keep going as they are now, there will no longer be a middle class. There will only be the haves and the have-nots. As the report itself states, quote, inequality may have broader negative impacts when the efforts by those at the top to maintain their positions divert resources from accelerating the transformations that are needed to achieve the 2030 agenda, end of quote. Nonetheless, the report fails to realize that it is the elite at the top of and behind the organization that want a one world government implemented so they can remain at the top and realize more power and control over the earth and its resources. It is they who cause the unequal distribution of wealth. Added to this problem is the amount of debt there is out in the world. How is that debt ever going to be paid off? It won't be. It cannot be. Not while the monetary system is comprised of paper fiat money or promises to pay, aka Federal Reserve notes, rather than real payment of gold and silver coin as mandated by the U.S. Constitution. Look at the cost of a college education. It is almost $40,000 per year. If you have 2 kids, you could be looking at a bill of $320,000. Student loans have overtaken credit card loans. Most students are taking out loans that they will be paying off for years after graduation. Many do not get a job right out of college, and even those that do, over half, do not get a job in the field of their major. If the United States can't get out of debt, if we and our kids are in debt to pay for an education that may not even get them the job they want, how are third world countries going to fare? The system is rigged, and it must be changed. Who built the buildings and bridges across the land? It was the workers who did the work, not the developers. Yet the workers did not own any of the wealth they created. Only the elite who financed it with fake money owned the real wealth of the land. The debt problem, the UN states, quote, we recognize the need to assist developing countries in obtaining long-term debt substantially through coordinated policies aimed at fostering debt financing, debt relief, debt restructuring, and sound debt management, as is appropriate. Many countries remain vulnerable to debt crisis, and some are in the middle of a crisis. including a number of least developed countries, small island developing states, and some developed countries. We reiterate that debtors and creditors must work together to prevent and resolve unsustainable debt situations. Maintaining sustainable debt levels is the responsibility of the borrowing countries. However, we acknowledge that lenders also have a responsibility to lend in a way that does not undermine a country's debt sustainability. Well, that leaves just about everybody out, because there's not one country in the world that has sustainable debt levels, including the United States. There is presently $15 trillion of negative sovereign debt floating around the world, which will never get paid off. That is why there are negative interest rates. Present-day monetary systems are simply wealth transference mechanisms that take from the many and give to the few, the elite. Some of these families have more money than states do. The largest corporations have more money than most nations, and especially third world countries that need the most help. This is where the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank come into play. They make loans to third world countries that can never be paid back. They don't want them to be paid back. They just want to rape and plunder all the natural resources they can get their hands on. Have you ever wondered why all third world countries are composed of civilizations that have been here for 5,000 years, yet the United States has only been here for 300 years, and we rule the entire planet? How did that happen? Simple. What's the biggest business in the world? Wars. Who's the number one arms dealer in the world? The U.S. is. We sell more arms than the rest of the world combined. And who has the most powerful military? We do. The U.S. is the biggest bully on the block. It's as simple as that. Do as we say or we'll blow you away. Until the monetary system is changed from a paper fiat promise to pay to gold and silver as the Constitution mandates, there can be no fixing of any of the major problems, as there's no way to pay for it. You can't pay debt off with more debt. It is as simple as that. Fix the money problem, and all the other problems can be dealt with. Until then, forget it. There's not a chance in hell. In regards to totalitarianism, the report states, quote, "We will implement the agenda for the full benefit of all, for today's generation and for future generations. In doing so, we affirm our commitment to international law and emphasize that the agenda is to be implemented in a manner that is consistent with the rights and obligations of states under international law." End of quote. Notice there is no mention here that each individual shall have permanent sovereignty over his wealth. The state has permanent sovereignty. That is not what the Constitution states. That is what the Communist Manifesto and the Illuminati state. This is corporate fascism by the elite plutocracy presently in power. Notice that a commitment is made to international law, not national law, not state law, not local law, but international law, the law of commerce. As the report states, quote, "Promote a universal, rules-based, open, non-discriminatory, and equitable multilateral trading system under the World Trade Organization, including through the conclusion of negotiations under its Doha agenda." End of quote. Now, this is what the elite plutocracy and transnational corporate behemoths are interested in: a one-world trading platform with a one-world currency. How nice and neat a package that would be to sell their wares in, a truly global marketplace. Did you know how Wall Street got its name? During the 1700s, there was a huge wall there and a huge market before it. Do you know what was sold at that market? Slaves. Thousands upon thousands of slaves were sold in front of the wall. Where did all the mansions in Rhode Island come from? The slave trade. As one U.S. ambassador has said, inequality may have broader negative impacts when the efforts by those at the top to maintain their positions divert resources from accelerating the transformations that are needed to achieve the 2030 agenda. However, this does not mean that the UN should not continue to do the good works it does. The problems in Africa and in the Middle East that are occurring are atrocious. Millions have been killed and millions have been and are being displaced. Help of all kinds is needed and being supplied. The UN is doing praiseworthy work in this regard, but a one-world government is not a fix-all for the world's problems. Change must come from within, not from without or from above, as wanted by the elite. Neither they nor any institution has the divine right to rule others, let alone the world. They seek their own betterment, not the betterment of others. Do not be fooled by the wolf that comes in sheep's clothing.